Expel the Americans, close their bases, we will defend ourselves. It sounds strange, doesn't it? Or maybe it sounds like Vladimir Putin's dreams. But these are the actual words of the President of France, Charles de Gaulle, who one day decided that NATO was a noose for France, not a protection. Today, when Ukraine is being fed promises of security guarantees instead of real NATO membership, and Donald Trump is threatening to turn NATO into an empty shell, we urgently need to remember the French lesson of 1966, how France managed to leave NATO's military bloc while remaining its ally. Why did Paris think Americans wouldn't give up New York for Paris? Spoiler, they also won't give up Washington for Kyiv. And most importantly, can Donald Trump now pull off de Gaulle's trick in reverse, formally remain in NATO, but withdraw his troops and leave Europe exposed? Let's break down this topic because the story of France leaving NATO is interesting and can help us understand the reality of today. My name is Alexei Pechi. Let's dive into this topic together. But before we start, I ask you to subscribe to this channel, give it a like, and leave any detailed comment under this episode. Also, subscribe to my Telegram channel, Pechi News. The link to it is in the description of this video. There, we post breaking news as it comes in. So, let's go back to 1966. The Cold War is in full swing and Europe is packed with American military bases. And then Charles de Gaulle makes a move that gives the White House a collective heart attack. He writes a letter to the President of the United States, Lyndon Johnson. The essence is simple. France is reclaiming its full sovereignty. All foreign troops must leave French soil, and that's final. A quote from the note of the French government from March 1966, quote, France believes that the changes that have taken place in the world no longer justify the military measures adopted after the formation of the alliance. Here you can understand de Gaulle. He didn't just leave the chat, as they say, he even kicked NATO headquarters out of Paris. Yes, that very NATO headquarters where the generals are now sitting in Brussels used to be in France. De Gaulle didn't care about diplomatic etiquette. You know, he gave the Allies just 1 year to pack up and said, you have 1 year to leave France. The reaction of the United States was completely hysterical, and the United States Secretary of State at that time, Dean Rusk, asked de Gaulle a legendary question that was full of venom. Quote, does your order for the withdrawal of American soldiers also apply to those soldiers who lie in the graves of Normandy? You know, this was a reference to the Allied landing in Normandy during World War II, of course. It sounded pretty harsh. De Gaulle did not waver and declared that France was leaving NATO anyway. Why did he do that? This is a key point for understanding the current situation in the relationship between the West and Ukraine. Listen very carefully here. Charles de Gaulle stated at the time that NATO, in its current form, is an instrument of subordination to the United States of America. In the integrated command, a French soldier was subordinate to an American general, and the general reported directly to the President of the United States. De Gaulle stated, and I quote, there can be no question of France losing the right to control its own forces. He actually said, and I quote Article 5 on collective security. That's certainly good, but having the button to the nuclear briefcase in my pocket is better. Interestingly, France eventually left the military organization, which is NATO's integrated structures, but remained a participant in the alliance's political treaty. This meant a simple thing. The French were basically telling their allies that in the event of World War III, of course, we will help our allies, but only in peacetime. Don't you dare tell us where our tanks should be stationed or how many soldiers should be in our army. And you know, France didn't fall apart after that. On the contrary, France became the only country in Europe that was ultimately respected both in Moscow and in Washington. Why is that? Yes, since the French also obtained nuclear weapons. In the early 21st century, under Sarkozy, they quietly rejoined NATO as if nothing had happened. And now let's apply this template to 2025 in Ukraine. Right now, NATO is telling us we won't take you yet so as not to anger Putin or Trump. It's necessary, but here are security guarantees, much like NATO's Article 5. They'll work just as well. Accept them and be happy. Do you know why? De Gaulle once withdrew from NATO's command because he didn't believe in those very security guarantees that are being promised to us today. In the 1960s, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics acquired the ability to launch a nuclear strike on the United States. Charles de Gaulle asked Americans a logical question, one every Ukrainian should now ask Trump. It sounded like this: ready to trade New York for Paris? He didn't get an answer. Well, to be precise, the answer is obvious. Of course not. And that's exactly why France created its own concept of a strike force at that time, meaning its own nuclear weapons. Paris's logic then was rock solid. The enemy, meaning the Soviet Union, had to know that a strike on France would definitely lead to unacceptable damage, even if the United States chickened out and didn't get involved in the situation. A quote from France's military doctrine of those years: "Deterrence must be national. Nuclear weapons are not shared with anyone." And now look at what's happening. Ukraine is being offered a security guarantee model based on bilateral agreements. But the history of France teaches us the following: guarantees without, your own big stick don't work. France left the umbrella of the United States of America because it was leaky, and France built its own nuclear umbrella and its own defense capability. After France left, NATO didn't collapse. It actually thrived. Why? Because they had to do everything themselves, meaning they acknowledged the fact that they needed to rely on their own strength. In the end, let's just go over it on the surface. The French developed Mirage and Rafale jets to avoid relying on American F-16s and built nuclear energy and a navy to avoid depending on Britain and the United States. And they maintained an independent foreign policy. If we apply all this to the Ukrainian reality, and if we look at the years, then any guarantees without restoring our own military-industrial complex and possibly returning to the issue of strategic deterrence. It's a fiction. Those are not real guarantees. De Gaulle once proved that allies only respect those who can tell them to go to hell and survive. Once again. Not opponents, but allies only respect those who can tell them to go to hell and still survive. But of course, there is also the other side of the coin in this story. Yes, the news is truly alarming, and I understand that with so much information, many people's minds are overwhelmed. We live in a state of chronic stress, and it's normal to get tired of it. By the way, if you feel like you're already at your limit, like your battery is dead and nothing brings you joy, then I have a recommendation for you. It's a YouTube channel. Bobby Rapsai is a channel by a really cool psychologist who, without using complicated terminology, explains very complex psychological processes using examples from daily news. And he explains what's happening to us. By the way, he recently released an excellent episode about why we feel tired even without work and how to deal with it. The link to Bobby Rapsai's YouTube channel is in the description of this video. Be sure to check it out, make sure to subscribe and watch the latest episodes. They're really helpful and it truly makes a difference. To get your head straight. Now let's continue. And this flip side of the coin really scares Europe. Just now we were talking about how France left NATO to become stronger, but let's imagine that the United States does the same thing, but in order to abandon Europe. Donald Trump has long admired the idea of sovereignty. Ironically, Trump might use this Charles de Gaulle strategy against Europe. What might that entail? Article 13 of the North Atlantic Treaty allows any country to leave the alliance 1 year after notifying all allies. But Trump doesn't even need to legally leave NATO. It's enough for him to do what Paris did in 1966. First, withdraw American officers from the integrated command in Europe. Second, pull troops out from bases in Germany and Poland, for example. And third, declare that the United States remains in the political alliance, but will only fight for, say, Estonia or even France if, for example, the United States Congress decides to do so. So politically they remain in the alliance, but in reality they do not. And this isn't just wishful thinking. The publication Politico has already written about Trump's plans to put NATO into what's called a dormant mode. This is a quote from one of the experts who is close to Donald Trump. "We aren't required to police the world. If Europe wants protection, they should pay and defend themselves." This mirrors Charles de Gaulle's policy. Only if France withdrew to defend itself, then the United States can withdraw to defend no one. And here Europe falls into the trap it has been building itself for 60 years. Let me explain what Charles de Gaulle's withdrawal means. The rest of the Europeans, especially the Germans, preferred to stay under the warm American wing instead of building their own European army. They traded sovereignty for comfort. Now, with a man in the White House who counts money instead of values, it turns out that Germany has problems with its army and Britain's navy has been reduced to a minimum. The Poles have been rapidly building up their army over the past 4 years. and the only army in Europe capable of fighting is the Ukrainian one, which NATO won't accept. By the way, France returned to NATO's military structures under Nicolas Sarkozy in 2009, and many Gaullists in France still consider this a betrayal. Well, because, as history has shown, Charles de Gaulle was right. Today you rely on Washington, but tomorrow Washington might turn isolationist or worse, side with your opponent. And that's why, let's sum up, the story of France leaving NATO's military structure is not just some story. Yes, it's not just archives and so on. It's a survival guide for a world where presidents' signatures are worth less than the ink they're written with. The Budapest Memorandum proves that. First of all, France has proven that NATO membership does not equal security. Security means having your own technologies, your own weapons, and the political will to use those weapons without coordinating with Washington. For Ukraine, this is a signal that no super-duper Article 5 type NATO security guarantees can replace, for example, a missile program, a strong economy, its own armed forces, and so on. Secondly, the golden share in NATO has always belonged to the one who wasn't afraid to be the bad guy. Now, that's an interesting point. At one time, de Gaulle was simply hated in the White House, Americans hated him, and, interestingly, called de Gaulle ungrateful, just like they call Zelensky. Today, by the way, people said the same thing to Charles de Gaulle. You're ungrateful, you don't thank the American people for their protection and help, and so on. But de Gaulle didn't care. Today, Ukraine is trying to be a good ally, negotiating, making compromises, and so on. But maybe it's time, to remember the French approach and start dictating our own terms. Like, listen, if you won't let us join NATO, and maybe we'll consider restoring our nuclear status. Maybe, well, we're not saying we'll definitely go for it, but maybe we'll think about it. Charles de Gaulle would definitely approve of such a move. And thirdly, there's the threat that the United States of America might pull a trick like that and leave NATO as a formal organization without troops. Today, it's more real than ever. Trump doesn't want to be the world's policeman. It's written just like that in his national security strategy. If the Americans leave Europe just like de Gaulle once kicked them out of France, then, excuse me, the European continent, it's doomed. Well, unless, of course, they unite around the only force that knows how to fight Russia today, around Ukraine. So, friends, history is cyclical, and in 1966 France said, we'll take care of ourselves. And in 2021, well, maybe all of Europe will have to say this now to say, we have to take care of ourselves and Ukraine first and foremost as well. It's finally time to say this and not always rely only on our allies. Friends, write your opinion about these analogies in the comments under this video, and in general, let us know what you think about France leaving NATO and whether there are any historical parallels with today. Friends, if this episode was useful for you, I ask you to support this YouTube channel financially with any donation or paid subscription using the links and details in the description of this video. That's it for now. Take care. Goodbye, everyone.